Hey look, another blast from the past. Over the last few years there have been a bunch of remakes and re-releases and enhanced ports of beloved games, underappreciated classics and other titles from over 2 decades ago. We got a modern port of one of the more expensive Final Fantasy games with 8. We got the Mana collection and a pretty good remake of Seiken Densetsu 3. We got Zombies Ate My Neighbors and Ghoul Patrol, Saga Frontier and Legend of Mana. We recently had Chrono Cross, Monster Rancher and Pocky and Rocky, with games like the Turtles Kawabanga collection and Advanced Wars looming on the horizon. And on the forefront of this remake renaissance are Square Enix, responsible for a myriad of all-time classics throughout most of commercial gaming's history. And now they brought back Live A Live, a mostly accurate recreation of the original game, aside from a few quality of life inclusions like a minimap, tutorials and gameplay tips, as well as a cutscene skip function, and of course the conversion of the game's visuals into Square's tried and true, patented HD-2D art style. Now I do like this art style. I was stunned by how beautiful Octopath Traveler looked, even though I didn't enjoy the game that much. And I was happy to see it return in Triangle Strategy. And I think this style is a great way to reimagine the iconic 16-bit pixel art of the past. That said, I don't want to see this style in everything. I don't want Square Enix to over-rely on this look. There is merit in keeping the original style, or in bringing everything into 3D like they did with Trials of Mana. And holy shit what Nintendo did with Link's Awakening. Such a neat art style. It looks like a diorama. For Live A Live, this art style is a really good fit. Most of the time it mimics the original art pretty well, but gives it so slightly more depth. But sometimes the game really uses the added dimension to have some moments really stand out. The game itself is something special, not necessarily good or well made or guaranteed entertainment for gamers of all ages, but important. Back when it first released, it was a brave experiment on how to approach storytelling in the pretty formulaic JRPG genre. A genre at the time dominated by Squaresoft, which probably only made this little venture possible in the first place. Live A Live isn't a grand story about a young hero venturing out and defeating evil with only a sword and the power of friendship. It is not a 100-hour-long epic full of twists and turns. Rather, it's a collection of short stories that broadly share the same gameplay and are loosely connected by more or less reoccurring characters and concepts, and the fact that all the different antagonists share the same name, more or less. Every chapter had its own character designer to further differentiate each story from the others, with every one of those designers having been a famous mangaka, with my favorite being Gosho Aoyama from Detective Conan. The remake added voice acting, both English and Japanese, and it ranges from bland to atrocious.
ちゃんと起きてるか？そいつはカトゥーが作ってた例のロボット。ん？は？
あ、カトゥーがずっと作っ。
While in most chapters the Japanese voices are at least fitting, during the Wild West chapter it becomes apparent in just how unfitting Japanese voice acting is for everything that isn't anime.
いや、おわんか。
マスター、こいつを貼っといてくれ。
Fortunately, it is possible to just turn down the voice volume to not have to suffer through all this. Gameplay. I mentioned Live A Live's battle system already a while back in my top 10 JRPG battle system video, though that one's in German, and I went over how I liked its ambition. It functions like an SRPG combat system, with friends and foes taking turns moving on a kind of chessboard and attacking whenever an enemy is in range. Attacks have different ranges and can hit either a single or multiple spaces at once, and you have to position your party correctly to have their attacks hit home and be always aware of your opponent's attack ranges and angles. In the original game, it was a bit hard to anticipate when and where you'll be safe after moving, and when an enemy might interrupt your turn to blast you with an attack. But in the remake, every combatant has their, let's call it, readiness shown above their head, as well as their remaining HP. As long as an enemy isn't fully ready, moving into range doesn't cause them to attack, and you can now reliably bait many enemies into wasting their turn to approach you without being able to attack. It is a bit less frustrating this way and lets you appreciate its creativity more than it was in the original version. On the other hand, you now see how shallow the system really is. While there is some tactics required in some fights, you'll mostly just spam your strongest or safest attacks all the time until you win. Your HP refills after each fight, and there are no other resources, no magic, no skill points, nothing. So not spamming strong attacks the whole time would be a waste of time. In chapters where fights are less prevalent, this still works well enough, but chapters where you constantly fight large groups of enemies, it becomes tedious pretty fast. There is very little depth to be found in the combat system as well as the equipment and leveling system, which wouldn't be a huge problem in a story-driven game, especially one that unconventional as this one is, if it wouldn't rely so damn much on fighting. And it really gets old pretty fast. When you're not fighting, you're reading exposition or a bit of flavor text, or you're exploring one of the many different environments in a very shallow way. There are no secrets or hidden items in this game. While you can interact with some objects for a bit of flavor text, items are always marked by sparkling light around a container. So you'll never need to look around healing or key items for too long, or search every pixel of a room for something. Which isn't a bad thing, on the contrary. It's sensible design, at least when it comes to items or interactions needed for progression. But with the way environments are mostly used in this game, they could have just been straight hallways for all intents and purposes. There are no meaningful choices to be made, there isn't a reason to interact with anything other than sparkling objects. Just follow the critical path and consume the story, because that's what the game is about. You're supposed to listen to the story the developers want to tell you, and they don't want you to be distracted. That's why there are only a handful of locations in each chapter, why there are no secrets, why there's no complex leveling or fighting. You can sometimes select a dialogue choice, but those only loop you around until you make the correct choice, and the game doesn't even cleverly hide it. This game provides a very specific, curated experience, and you have to be okay with that fact to enjoy the story. So how is this game structured? At the start, you are presented with 7 different chapters in 7 different time periods that you can select in any order. These chapters don't influence each other and don't cross over to one another. You just observe a specific moment in time, one at a time. Completing all 7 chapters opens up the finale, where all you've done and experienced comes together for one last chapter. I won't get into too much detail when it comes to the story, but I will give a brief overview over each of the 7 regular chapters. And I'm mentioning them in the order I've played them, which wasn't necessarily the best order, but well, what's done is done. Wild West. In this chapter we assume the role of a notorious gunslinger called the Sundown Kid, who has a pretty big bounty on his head and has been hunted and challenged by the bounty hunter Mad Dog multiple times already. After escaping his pursuer once again, Sundown finds himself in a quiet little town about to be attacked by a group of feared bandits, so now he has to join forces with Mad Dog and help the town prepare for the incoming attack by setting traps and arming the townspeople. This story tries to emulate the vibe of The Magnificent Seven, with a focus on tension as you prepare for the attack and hope that everything works out in the end, with very little actual fighting. An enjoyable chapter, not too long though, but then again, maybe that's for the best. The Near Future. In this chapter you're Akira, a small delinquent with a strong sense of his own brand of justice, living in an orphanage. A local gang is abducting children all over town for some nefarious reason, and Akira tries to get to the bottom of it. This chapter plays the most like a classic JRPG, complete with a bunch of random encounters and even an overworld. The gimmick of this chapter is the psychic abilities of the protagonist. During exploration, he can read the minds of pretty much every NPC. During combat, he gets access to a bunch of ranged special attacks to confuse or frighten his opponents. And during cutscenes, he's a telekinetic and can do pretty much anything the plot needs him to. The story is incredibly anime with grand conspiracies, little siblings, and way too cool anti-heroes and even giant robots. A real treat for anime lovers. Present day. This is a really short chapter about a fighter on his way to the top. For that he has to defeat the currently strongest fighters in one-on-one combat and learn their hidden techniques by getting hit by them himself. There's not much to say about this chapter. All you do is selecting one of your 6 opponents, one after another, and defeat them in battle. You want to avoid beating your opponents until you've learned all their attacks, but that's about the extent of all the strategy you need to employ. It is a lot of fun for what it is, and it wouldn't work in any other game or project. This chapter is just the perfect fit for the way this game is structured. Prehistoric Times. This chapter is another one more akin to classic JRPGs, but its gimmick is that language hasn't been invented yet, so characters only point and grunt all the time. Well, sometimes they seem to perfectly describe things or people to have them appear in little thought bubbles and everyone can understand them. Nevertheless, this approach gives dialogues and cutscenes a unique dynamic, and the game needs to work more with overly exaggerated animations, and most cutscenes have a really high energy. The story is about a young caveman that helps to hide a woman on the run from another tribe that wants to sacrifice her, and later needs to escape with her together. Since he's a pretty good hunter, he can smell enemies with a button press and have them appear as dust clouds on screen, so you can see when and where to avoid random encounters. This chapter features the most comedy in the whole game and is overall a very light-hearted classic JRPG. The Distant Future. This chapter differs the most from the rest of the game. It has the least amount of combat, appearing only in a game you can choose to play. For the most part, this chapter is more like a walking simulator, or maybe a visual novel with a bit of walking in between. You'll mostly walk from cutscene to cutscene and just observe. That is, before this chapter devolves into outright horror. The whole story takes place on a small spaceship, where strange things soon start to happen. You're a small maintenance robot that mostly just observes the crew and attends to menial tasks, but might be the crew's only chance for survival when things go horribly wrong. This one is a slow burner, and the constant need to walk back and forth across the whole ship can get a bit tedious, but during its second half the chapter ramps up the tension, presents its not too unique mystery in a very engaging way, and depicts its cast in a way that's generally not that common in JRPGs. Edo period Japan. Hoo boy! This one was pretty ambitious and I can respect the idea, but I wouldn't say I had much fun playing it. So here you're a ninja tasked with breaking out a prisoner in a castle full of enemies and traps. This castle is just a huge labyrinth with a million rooms, hidden paths, shortcuts, locked doors, traps, secret bosses. This chapter goes all out. And on top of that, you can choose to go in slaughtering everyone or sneak your way past all the guards. And perceptive players will find a lot of opportunities to avoid enemies and skip sections of the castle, so the sneak approach can offer a lot of fun. It will also offer a lot of frustration with traps and hidden enemies you can't anticipate, so you need to save often and just try again. The big problem with offering a stealth route is, though, that there are mandatory bosses that you need to beat regardless which approach you take. So you still need to fight and level up, but to not have your kill count going up, you need to grind rats and monsters in the attic or the basement. I don't know what the developers were thinking with this one. The castle is this huge playground with so many secrets to find, the only chapter in the game where exploration truly matters, but one of the two approaches is just not viable, at least not in a fun way. So just kill everyone you come across and don't engage with the ninja fantasy. Imperial China. This is a classic kung fu story. An aging martial arts master is gathering disciples that will carry on his fighting style after he's gone. The first half is devoted to training his disciples, and for that you have to fight and defeat them over and over again, which rewards them with level ups and further stat boosts. The second half is closer to classic RPGing, with a rival master and his devoted followers who have been terrorizing the surrounding villages for some time now, attacking the school, and now we have to take the fight back to them and end their rule of fear for good. This chapter landed squarely in the middle for me. I didn't really appreciate the pacing, with long stretches of back-to-back fights broken up only by cutscenes, and this is once again a chapter with next to no exploration. The story was fine, the gameplay not really my cup of tea. But I guess that's something many will experience with a lot of the chapters, maybe even every single one. This isn't a straightforward experience, this isn't a polished gem of an RPG. It's a weird approach to tell a set of stories that wouldn't have been possible in a different format, at least not at the time. Today, with the ever-growing indie scene, we get smaller releases that tell unusual stories every single day. This game was something special back in the day, and I think it still is, but we don't need a modern Live A Live these days. But it was the perfect time to bring this game back and give it another chance. It's not a perfect game, and there's a good chance you might not like it. But it is worth a try. And with that, I bid you adieu. Have a great day, that's it from Rady, and I hope to see you again on the next game.
オイルと空き瓶で火炎瓶が時間が少しかかるが作るか。よし、できたぜ。火炎瓶だ。